Yesterday morning at 10:50 Atlantic time, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck 60 miles east of Barbuda in the eastern Caribbean. No deaths, no tsunami, no headlines. But the fault underneath that earthquake is one of the most loaded, least monitored, and least publicly known major subduction zones on Earth, and the last time it ruptured, it killed 6,000 people in a single morning. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what just moved, what's underneath it, and why 7 million people are sitting on top of it without the warning infrastructure they need. Let's get into it. Yesterday morning at 10:50 Atlantic Standard Time, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck approximately 70 kilometers east-southeast of Codrington, the principal town of the island of Barbuda, in the eastern Caribbean. The United States Geological Survey logged it as Event US 6000, Psi 84. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center, working independently from a different network of stations on a different continent, reported the same event with the same magnitude 6.0, with the epicenter at 17.257 degrees north, 61.327 degrees west. The shaking was felt across the entire Leeward Islands. Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, Nevis, Montserrat, Anguilla, Saint Martin, and Saint Martin, Saint Barthélemy, Guadeloupe, the northern coast of the United States Virgin Islands, and the northeastern corner of Puerto Rico. Reports from across the region describe between 30 and 45 seconds of slow, rolling, low-frequency motion, the kind of shaking that wakes you up but does not knock things off shelves. No buildings of consequence collapsed. No people died. The U.S. Geological Survey's Pager Alert System issued a green level assessment, the lowest of 4 categories, meaning fewer than 1 fatality and less than $1 million in damage was expected, and that assessment was correct. 9 minutes after the rupture began, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration logged a tsunami warning bulletin for the Leeward Islands and Caribbean Sea. The bulletin was advisory rather than evacuation directed, calibrated to the actual size of the event, and it was allowed to expire without escalation. No wave came, no coast was struck. By the standards that decide what makes the American news cycle in 2026, this was nothing. A magnitude 6 earthquake, 10 miles down, 60 miles offshore, from a town most Americans cannot find on a map. The planet produces approximately 140 events of this size every year. This is the 21st one of 2026. You could scroll past it without losing anything important, except that the address of an earthquake is sometimes more important than its magnitude, and the address of this one matters. The fault that produced yesterday's earthquake is the Lesser Antilles Megathrust. If you have not heard the name before, that is part of the story I want to tell you tonight. The Lesser Antilles is the chain of volcanic arc islands that runs in a gentle curve along the eastern boundary of the Caribbean basin. From north to south, Anguilla, St. Martin, St. Knight, Barthélemy, Saint Kitts, Nevis, Montserrat, Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and Grenada at the southern tip. The curve traces, almost exactly, the line where 2 tectonic plates are colliding. The plates are the North American plate. Yes, the same North American plate that California sits on, and that the eastern seaboard sits on, and the Caribbean plate. The North American plate is bending downward and being shoved westward into the mantle, underneath the Caribbean plate. The rate of this convergence is approximately 18 to 20 millimeters per year, about 3/4 of an inch per year. About the rate at which your fingernails grow. That number comes from decades of GPS measurements made on the islands, measured against fixed reference frames over years of accumulated data. It is one of the most reliable numbers in modern geodesy. That is a slow rate by global standards. The Japan Trench moves about 4 times faster. Cascadia moves about twice as fast. Slow loading does not mean small earthquakes. It just means longer recurrence intervals between the large ones. A subduction zone moving at 20 millimeters per year accumulates the strain for a magnitude 8 earthquake in approximately 200 years. The slow ones store the same amount of energy. They just take longer to do it. There is one geometric property of the Lesser Antilles arc that makes it genuinely unlike any other major subduction zone on Earth, and you should understand it before we go further. In every other major megathrust system in the world, the population centers sit well inland of the subduction trench. In Cascadia, Portland and Seattle and Vancouver are 150 kilometers landward of the trench, which gives a megathrust tsunami 15 to 25 minutes of travel time before it reaches the inhabited coast. In Japan, the eastern coast of Honshu sits a similar distance west of the Japan Trench. In South America, Lima and Santiago are similarly inland of their respective subduction trenches. The Lesser Antilles arc is different. The volcanic arc islands themselves, Antigua, Guadeloupe, Martinique, the entire string sit, geologically speaking, directly above the locked portion of the plate interface. They are the surface expression of the magma generated by the descending plate. They are not behind the trench. They are above the locked zone. And the towns built on those islands, Pointe-à-Pitre on Guadeloupe, Fort-de-France on Martinique, St. John's on Antigua, Basseterre on Street, Kitts, every coastal settlement on every island sit at sea level, on flat coastal plains, on land that was created by the same tectonic system that, when it ruptures, produces both the shaking and the wave at essentially the same instant. There is, geometrically, no separation between the people and the fault. They are sitting on top of it. A Cascadia rupture kills you with a wave that arrives 15 minutes after the shaking stops. A Lesser Antilles rupture, if it produces a comparable wave, kills you with shaking and a wave that arrive within the same minute. That is the system that produced yesterday's magnitude 6. And here's the part of yesterday's data that almost nobody has been talking about, but that you should know. The two seismological agencies that characterize the event disagree on its depth by 29 kilometers. The U.S. Geological Survey placed the hypocenter at 30 kilometers below the surface. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center placed it at 58.9 kilometers. A 29-kilometer disagreement on a moderate earthquake is at the very high end of normal for any region on Earth. In a properly instrumented zone, California, the Pacific Northwest, Central Japan, the two agencies would normally agree within a few kilometers. The disagreement is a direct symptom of how thin the seismic network is east of the Lesser Antilles arc. There are not enough seismometers close to the rupture to pin down the depth tightly, and the depth determines what kind of earthquake this was. At 30 kilometers, the rupture is plausibly on or very close to the plate interface itself, a megathrust event, releasing a small amount of the strain that the interface has been accumulating. At 59 kilometers, the rupture is intraslab, inside the descending plate, essentially decoupled from the megathrust strain budget. We will probably never know which interpretation is correct for this specific event. The data are too thin. What we can say is that the ambiguity itself is part of the story. To understand why the system this earthquake occurred on is worth paying attention to, you have to know what happened on this same fault in the year 1843. On the morning of Wednesday, February the 8th, 1843, at approximately 10:35 in the morning local time, the ground beneath the town of Pointe-à-Pitre on the island of Guadeloupe began to move. Pointe-à-Pitre at the time was the second busiest port in the French Caribbean, with about 16,000 permanent residents, a cathedral, a merchant quarter, a French colonial administration, and the usual layered colonial-era population. The shaking lasted between 70 and 90 seconds. Hold that number for a moment. A moderate earthquake, the kind that wakes you up and rattles dishes, produces 5 to 15 seconds of strong shaking. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in California, magnitude 6.9, killed 63 people and lasted about 15 seconds. The 1994 Northridge earthquake, magnitude 6.7, 57 dead, lasted 10 to 15 seconds. The shaking the people of Pointe-à-Pitre experienced was 5 to 7 times longer than either of those. Duration of shaking, at that scale, is only produced by ruptures hundreds of kilometers long, on faults whose total break takes more than a minute to complete. The cathedral fell first. The merchant quarter fell next. Fires started in the rubble and joined and burned for 3 days. The death toll on the island of Guadeloupe alone was approximately 5,000 to 6,000 people. Some contemporary estimates were as high as 8,000. Casualties were also reported on Antigua, Montserrat, Nevis, and St. Kitts, and the earthquake was felt across the entire eastern Caribbean. For most of the past century, the magnitude of the 1843 earthquake was estimated at around 7.5. In 2011, a team led by Nathalie Foyer at the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris reanalyzed the full intensity and damage record across the entire affected region and revised the estimate upward to a moment magnitude between 8.0 and 8.5. An independent reanalysis by Susan Huff at the U.S. Geological Survey in 2013 confirmed the revision. The current scientific consensus is that the 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake was probably a magnitude 8 to 8.5 event. That is 1 to 2.5 magnitude units larger than yesterday's earthquake. And because the magnitude scale is logarithmic, a magnitude 8 earthquake releases about 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 6. A magnitude 8.5 releases about 5,000 times more. What this fault did, in living historical memory, was 3 orders of magnitude larger than what it did yesterday. Now consider what has happened since 1843. If we take the revised 8 to 8.5 magnitude estimates seriously, then the segment of the arc that ruptured in 1843 has been quietly accumulating strain again at the same 18 to 20 millimeters per year rate for 183 years. The total accumulated slip deficit on that segment, the amount of motion that would have occurred if the fault were slipping smoothly at the plate convergence rate, but did not because the fault is locked, is on the order of 3 to 3.5 meters. 3 meters of stored strain. The kind of stored strain that, in a subduction zone, only resolves through one mechanism, the abrupt release in a major earthquake. Now, subduction zones do not run on schedules. The recurrence interval between great earthquakes on any given segment is quasi-periodic events, cluster around a characteristic mean, with very large variance on both sides. A subduction zone with a 200-year mean recurrence has produced consecutive events 150 years apart and consecutive events 400 years apart, and there is no way to predict from elapsed time alone where the next one will fall. The phrase overdue is technically wrong for any subduction zone. The correct technical phrase is within the recurrence time uncertainty range. 1843 was a long time ago. The fault has been reloading. The system is somewhere within that uncertainty range. That is what we know. But here is the additional uncomfortable piece of the picture. Yesterday's earthquake did not happen on the 1843 segment. It happened on the segment immediately to the north, the northern leeward segment, the stretch of arc that runs from Antigua and Barbuda up through Anguilla. And that segment has been silent for considerably longer. The last confirmed magnitude 7.5 or greater event on the northern leeward segment was in 1690. 336 years ago. That is the longest documented seismic gap on any segment of the entire Lesser Antilles arc, in a region whose recurrence intervals appear to be on the order of 200 years. The seismic gap concept is contested in seismology. It is not a reliable predictor of when the next event will happen on a specific segment, but it does identify segments that are at minimum not less hazardous than the rest of the system. And the northern leewards is also the segment with the sparsest seismic monitoring, the most uncertain depth determinations for individual events, and the least published consensus on how much of the interface is actually locked. How loaded is it? The honest answer is we do not know. 3 different scientific teams have tried to estimate it. Luis Lopez and colleagues in 2006, using the GPS data available at that time, inferred near-zero coupling on the northern arc, which would mean the fault is sliding aseismically and is unlikely to produce large events. Walter Maneker and colleagues in 2008, with denser data, revised the estimate to 20 to 30% coupled. Steve Smythe and colleagues in 2015, with more than a decade of additional measurements, put the central arc at 30 to 50% and the northern leewards at 10 to 20%. Every author agrees the interface is at least partly locked. No author can put a number on it with less than plus or minus 20% uncertainty. What this means for the question of when the next major event might occur is uncomfortable. If coupling is at the low end of those estimates, the strain is accumulating slowly, and the elapsed time since 1690 might still represent a small fraction of the recurrence interval. If it is at the high end, the strain is accumulating faster, and the elapsed time represents a much larger fraction. The honest scientific answer to when is the next event depends on a number nobody can yet pin down to better than a factor of 2 or 3. And here is where the geology hands off to the part of this story that humans actually have control over, because the fault is what it is, but the consequences of the next major event on it depend on what we have built on top of it, and what we have built to warn the people on top. Let me walk through the population picture, because the size of the exposure on this fault is not a number most Americans carry around in their heads. Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory at the northern end of the arc, has a population of approximately 3.2 million people. That is larger than the populations of 15 U.S. states. 3.2 million American citizens, all of them on a single island, all of them within the impact zone of a future Lesser Antilles Megathrust event or a regional tsunami. The United States Virgin Islands add another 87,000 U.S. citizens. The British Virgin Islands add another 31,000. Anguilla, 16,000. Saint Martin and Sint Maarten combined, 75,000. Saint Barthélemy, 10,000. Saba and Saint Eustatius combined, 5,000. Saint Kitts and Nevis, 48,000. Antigua and Barbuda, the country where yesterday's earthquake occurred, 97,000. Montserrat, 5,000. Then the French Antilles, Guadeloupe, 395,000 French citizens. Martinique, 360,000. Both are full metropolitan French territories with the institutional infrastructure that French national status implies. Continuing south, Dominica, 73,000. Saint Lucia, 180,000. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, 110,000. Grenada, at the southern tip, 125,000. Barbados, 280,000. That is approximately 6.5 to 7 million permanent residents in the direct exposure footprint of the Lesser Antilles arc. The full Caribbean basin exposure to a worst-case basin-wide tsunami, including the northern Caribbean populations of Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the Cayman Islands adds another 25 to 30 million on top of that. And here is the geographic problem. These are narrow volcanic islands, most of them less than 10 miles across at any point. The interior is mountainous, rainforest, no road network. The habitable land is the coastal plain, the narrow strip between the water and the mountain. The towns are built on that strip. For most coastal residents, there is no inland to retreat to within the time interval a local source tsunami would allow. Vertical evacuation, purpose-built reinforced structures that can hold a population above the wave is, in this geography, not a supplementary measure. It is the only measure that physics allows to work. The number of purpose-built tsunami vertical evacuation structures across the entire Lesser Antilles arc, from Anguilla to Grenada, is, by the best available accounting, 0. On top of the permanent population, the region receives approximately 30 million stayover tourists per year, and another 28 to 30 million cruise ship passenger days. Resort properties are systematically built at the waterfront, on land specifically chosen because it is flat, near the water, and below the historical high water line. Cruise passengers spend a single day on shore with no functional awareness of evacuation routes. And the peak tourism season, December through April, overlaps the historical records clustering of major regional events in winter months. The Caribbean has a regional tsunami warning system. It was established in 2005 under the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in direct response to the December 26, 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami that killed approximately 230,000 people. Before 2005, the Caribbean basin had no regional tsunami warning system at all. The Pacific equivalent, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, operated by the United States out of Honolulu, has been operational since 1949. That is a 56-year delay between when the Pacific got a regional tsunami warning system and when the Caribbean got one. The Caribbean system currently includes approximately 100 sea level monitoring stations. The Pacific equivalent has approximately 1,000. Operational maturity for the Caribbean system was reached around 2015. As of 2026, it has been functionally operational for roughly a decade. It has never been tested by an event comparable to 1843. Whether it would perform adequately in such a test is, in the most honest formulation, unknown. There is also an inundation mapping gap. Detailed maps that translate an offshore tsunami source into street-by-street predicted flood depth and arrival times exist for Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the French Antilles. They are incomplete for the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean, Antigua, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, the Grenadines, Barbados, the smaller islands. That gap is not a scientific problem. The science of inundation modeling is mature. It is a budget problem. The maps are missing because the institutional resources to make them were allocated to other regions first. So here is the situation honestly. The fault is real, mapped, monitored, and capable of producing events at the 1843 scale. The regional warning system, designed to provide preparation and response capacity for such an event, is approximately 1 decade into its operational existence. The inundation maps and evacuation would require are incomplete for the islands that would be most exposed. The vertical evacuation infrastructure the geometric reality of the islands requires does not exist. The system is, in every quantifiable measure, less prepared than its specific equivalents to handle the kind of event the historical record indicates this fault can produce. That is the gap. That is what yesterday's magnitude 6 just briefly reminded us is sitting there. For yesterday's earthquake specifically, the answer is mostly that nothing happens next. Aftershocks at small magnitudes will continue at a declining rate for days to weeks. There is no scientific reason to expect escalation. The event was, almost certainly, a routine stress release on a complex plate boundary. The one short-term signal worth watching is any cluster of magnitude 4 or larger events in the same source area in the next 7 to 14 days. That would be the only data that would change the interpretation. So far, there is no such cluster. For the broader system, there are 3 things to watch for, in order of how cost-effectively they would reduce the eventual consequences of a future major event. First, completion of tsunami inundation mapping for the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean at the same resolution that already exists for Puerto Rico and the French Antilles. Second, expansion of the strong motion accelerometer network east of the arc, particularly on Antigua, Anguilla, and Barbuda, the network that would, in a future event, allow real-time depth and rupture extent determination in the first minute after the rupture. Third, vertical evacuation infrastructure. Even one well-placed tower in each of the most exposed coastal towns would change the survivability calculation for a future magnitude 8 scenario in a way no warning system can. None of these 3 things requires new science. All of them require institutional and political will that, historically, has been allocated to other regions. The Pacific has documentaries about Cascadia. The Eastern Caribbean has not had its turn. The honest framing is this: the fault is what it is. The history is what it is. The exposure is what it is. The infrastructure is what it is. The next major event on the Lesser Antilles Megathrust is coming. We do not get to know when. The geology will decide on its own schedule, and the schedule is not subject to anything human civilization can do. What we control is everything that happens between now and then. And right now, between now and then, we are doing very little. The 7 million people who live in the exposure footprint deserve to know that. The 30 million who visit every year deserve to know that. And the institutions that nominally represent their interests in the construction of warning systems and inundation maps and building codes deserve to be asked, today, why one of the most loaded major subduction zones on the planet has, in 2026, the second newest regional tsunami warning system on Earth, and essentially 0 vertical evacuation infrastructure. Yesterday's magnitude 6 was small. The system underneath it is not. We'll be tracking this as it develops.